July, 1776. Inside a crowded hall in Philadelphia, a declaration is read aloud to a restless audience. We hold these truths to be self-evident. With those words, 13 colonies announce their separation from the most powerful empire on earth. They list their grievances. They name their oppressor. At the center of their accusation stands one man. King of Great Britain. Cut to London. Across the Atlantic, seated in royal authority, is George III. To some, he is a tyrant, a stubborn monarch who refused to listen. To others, he is a constitutional ruler, bound by parliament and circumstance. And to many historians, he is something far more tragic. A king who lost an empire, and eventually, his own mind. Was he truly the villain of the American Revolution? Or was he a symbol onto whom a revolution projected its anger? Was he a defender of royal authority? Or a man trapped by the very system he sought to preserve? To understand the legend, we must return to the beginning. To a young prince who never expected history to judge him so harshly. On the morning of June 4, 1738, in Norfolk House at St. James's Square, London, a child was born into a dynasty that still felt faintly foreign to many of its subjects. He was christened George William Frederick, the grandson of George II and the son of Frederick, Prince of Wales. The House of Hanover had ruled Britain since 1714, yet it remained, in accent and instinct, unmistakably German. The new prince entered a court divided by rivalries, sharpened by suspicion, and overshadowed by the complicated relationship between his father and grandfather. Few could have predicted that this quiet, serious child would one day become one of the most consequential monarchs in British history, George III. From the beginning, George's upbringing set him apart. Unlike his predecessors, he was born on British soil and spoke English as his first language. This fact would later become central to his identity. In a dynasty often criticized for its continental priorities, George would consciously present himself as a patriot king, British by birth, education, and sentiment. But in childhood, the politics of image meant little. What mattered more was the instability within his own family. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had long been estranged from George II. The rift between them was not merely personal, it was political, theatrical, and public. Frederick cultivated an image as a patron of opposition politicians and a defender of true British liberties against what he portrayed as his father's heavy-handed rule. Young George grew up in the shadow of this tension, in a household that existed almost as a parallel court. The message was subtle but powerful: monarchy was not simply inherited, it was contested, shaped, and defended. Tragedy struck early. In 1751, when George was just 13 years old, his father died suddenly from a lung injury, reportedly caused by a blow from a cricket ball years earlier. The loss transformed the boy's destiny overnight. No longer a secondary royal figure, he became the heir apparent. The weight of expectation descended swiftly. His mother, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, determined that her son would not repeat what she saw as the moral and political failings of the court around them. She instilled in him a deep sense of duty, personal piety, and moral seriousness. Central to George's intellectual formation was his tutor and mentor, John Stuart, the Earl of Bute. Bute's influence would later become controversial, but in these formative years he provided structure and guidance. The young prince was educated in a manner unusually rigorous for a royal heir. He studied mathematics, astronomy, history, literature, and the sciences. He developed a genuine interest in agriculture and mechanics, subjects that seemed almost rustic for a future king. Yet this practicality would become one of his defining characteristics. Unlike the flamboyant princes of earlier generations, George was reserved, disciplined, and cautious. He did not gamble heavily, nor did he cultivate the mistresses that had been common among Hanoverian rulers. He valued order and domestic stability. Even as a teenager, he seemed uncomfortable with the excesses of court life. Observers described him as earnest, sometimes stiff, but sincere. In a monarchy often criticized for corruption and foreign influence, this seriousness felt refreshing to some, and suspiciously self-righteous to others. By the mid-1750s, Britain was on the brink of a global conflict that would later be known as the 7 Years' War. Though still a prince, George observed the unfolding struggle with intense interest. The war pitted Britain against France in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. It was a contest not merely of armies but of empires. Britain's identity as a rising global power was being forged in battlefields and oceans far from London. The young heir absorbed these developments carefully. He understood that the crown was no longer just a ceremonial institution, it was the symbolic center of a worldwide empire. In 1756, when open war broke out, Britain's political scene grew increasingly unstable. Governments rose and fell. Public debate intensified. Parliament asserted its authority in new ways. George watched the fragility of ministerial power and the volatility of public opinion. These lessons would shape his own approach to kingship. He would not be a passive figurehead, nor would he abandon the political field entirely to Parliament. On October 25, 1760, the old king, George II, died suddenly of an aortic aneurysm at Kensington Palace. The 22-year-old prince ascended the throne. His accession marked a turning point not just for him, but for Britain itself. At his first meeting with the Privy Council, the new king delivered a line that would echo through history: "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." It was a calculated declaration. He was signaling a break from the perception that the Hanoverians were outsiders. He was claiming Britain not merely as a realm to rule, but as a homeland. The contrast with his grandfather was immediate. George II had been blunt, often temperamental, and unapologetically German in his loyalties. George III presented himself as morally upright, domestically inclined, and devoted to national interests. He cultivated an image of simplicity and virtue. Yet beneath this composed exterior lay a determined will. He believed firmly in the authority of the crown, though not in the crude absolutism that had toppled earlier dynasties. Instead, he envisioned a balanced system in which the monarch guided and influenced government without being overtly tyrannical. The Britain he inherited in 1760 was victorious but financially strained. The 7 Years' War was nearing its conclusion, and British forces were gaining ground across continents. Yet victory came at enormous cost. Debt soared. Managing a rapidly expanding empire would require new policies, new taxes, and new political calculations. George stepped into power at a moment when Britain's triumph concealed future instability. As the young king began his reign, many viewed him with cautious optimism. Here was a monarch who appeared virtuous, diligent, and unmistakably British. He married young, avoided scandal, and projected steadiness. But the very qualities that distinguished him, his sense of personal duty, his conviction in royal influence, his belief in moral authority, would soon collide with a rapidly changing political world. In 1760, few could foresee that this earnest young king would preside over the loss of America, endure bouts of debilitating illness, and oversee wars that would reshape Europe. For now, he stood at the threshold of power, determined to be a different kind of monarch, a king not defined by foreign birth or reckless indulgence, but by discipline, national identity, and unwavering belief in the crown's place at the heart of Britain's destiny. The prince who had grown up in a divided court was now sovereign of a global empire. The experiment of a patriot king had begun. When George III ascended the throne in 1760, he inherited more than a crown, he inherited a political system in transition. Britain was not an absolute monarchy, nor was it a modern parliamentary democracy. Power flowed through a delicate balance of crown, cabinet, and parliament. Ministers governed, but the king appointed them. Parliament legislated, but the monarch still possessed influence, patronage, and prestige. Into this complex structure stepped a young sovereign determined not to be overshadowed. From the beginning, George III made it clear that he intended to play an active role in government. Unlike his grandfather, who had often relied heavily on dominant ministers, the new king believed the monarch should shape policy and guide the direction of the state. This did not mean he sought tyranny. Rather, he believed in what political theorists of the time described as a patriot king, a ruler who rose above faction and party to act in the national interest. The challenge, however, was that Britain's political system thrived on faction. His first major decision revealed both his confidence and his vulnerability. He appointed his former tutor and trusted advisor, John Stuart, the Earl of Bute, as a central figure in his government. Bute was intelligent and cultured, but he lacked deep roots in parliamentary politics. Worse still, he was Scottish at a time when anti-Scottish sentiment lingered in England. Many saw him not as a capable minister, but as the king's favorite, an outsider elevated through personal affection rather than merit. Bute's influence sparked suspicion almost immediately. Political opponents accused him of manipulating the young king. Pamphleteers mocked him. Caricaturists attacked him. In the coffeehouses of London, whispers circulated that the Crown was attempting to undermine parliamentary independence. Whether these accusations were fair mattered less than the perception. The image of royal interference took hold. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War was drawing to a close. Britain stood on the brink of a monumental victory over France, having secured significant territories in North America and India. Negotiating peace required careful diplomacy. Bute favored ending the war swiftly to reduce the national debt, which had ballooned to unprecedented levels. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally concluded the conflict, confirming Britain's emergence as a global imperial power. Yet peace brought its own dilemmas. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. Maintaining troops in newly acquired territories was expensive. Ministers began searching for ways to stabilize finances. One obvious source of revenue lay across the Atlantic, the American colonies. They had benefited from British military protection during the war. Should they not share more of the financial burden? In 1763, Bute resigned amid mounting criticism. His departure did not calm the political waters. Instead, it exposed the deeper instability within Britain's system of government. George III would spend the next decade navigating a revolving door of ministers, each struggling to maintain authority in a divided parliament. George Grenville, who followed Bute as Prime Minister, pursued a stricter fiscal policy. Determined to reduce debt, he introduced the Stamp Act in 1765, requiring the American colonies to pay taxes on printed materials. The measure seemed reasonable to many in Britain. After all, Parliament had long asserted its right to tax imperial possessions. But in America, the reaction was explosive. Colonists argued that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. The crisis placed George III in a difficult position. Though he had approved Grenville's policies, he was not the architect of them. Nevertheless, colonial anger increasingly focused on the crown. To Americans, the king symbolized British authority. The nuances of parliamentary procedure mattered little. Protesters burned effigies. Boycotts spread. Political resistance intensified. In 1765, George dismissed Grenville and turned to the Marquis of Rockingham, whose government repealed the Stamp Act the following year. Yet even repeal carried contradiction. Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The underlying constitutional conflict remained unresolved. The rapid turnover of ministries created an impression of chaos. Rockingham's government fell in 1766, replaced by William Pitt the Elder, later Earl of Chatham. Pitt was widely respected for his leadership during the war, but illness soon limited his effectiveness. In his absence, Charles Townshend pushed through new duties on colonial imports, reigniting tensions. Throughout these transitions, critics claimed the king was orchestrating events behind the scenes, favoring ministers who aligned with his preferences and dismissing those who did not. Supporters countered that George was merely exercising traditional royal prerogatives. The truth lay somewhere between. He believed deeply in the crown's right to influence government. He disliked rigid party factions and preferred ministers loyal to him personally rather than to political groups. By 1770, Lord North emerged as Prime Minister, forming one of the longest-serving administrations of George's reign. North possessed political skill, charm, and a pragmatic temperament. Importantly, he enjoyed the king's confidence. Their partnership would define the next phase of British policy toward America. Behind the scenes, George worked diligently. He read reports carefully, annotated documents, and maintained extensive correspondence. He was no idle monarch. Yet his determination to assert royal influence increasingly drew criticism from those who believed Britain was evolving toward parliamentary supremacy. To them, the king's interventions felt like regression, a step backward toward monarchical dominance. At the same time, the British public remained divided. Many admired George's personal morality and domestic stability. He married Queen Charlotte in 1761 and cultivated an image of family virtue unusual for a Hanoverian monarch. This contrast with the scandal-prone courts of Europe strengthened his popularity at home. The king appeared sincere, hard-working, and devoted to national prosperity. Still, political storms gathered strength. In the American colonies, resentment hardened into organized resistance. In Britain, debates over constitutional authority grew sharper. Was Parliament sovereign over the empire? Did colonial assemblies possess inherent rights? And what role should the king play in mediating, or enforcing, these questions? George III did not view himself as an oppressor. He saw his duty as preserving imperial unity and parliamentary authority. To yield entirely to colonial demands, in his view, would undermine Britain's global standing and encourage further dissent. Yet each attempt to assert authority risked deepening the divide. By the end of the 1760s, the pattern was clear. The king's reign would not be defined by ceremonial stability, but by constant negotiation between crown and cabinet. He was neither a puppet nor an autocrat. Instead, he operated within a constitutional gray area, testing the limits of royal influence at a time when those limits were still being defined. The struggle between monarch and ministers was not merely a personal drama, it reflected a broader transformation in British governance. The old system of patronage and royal preference was colliding with the emerging force of public opinion and parliamentary organization. George III stood at the center of this transformation, determined to shape events, yet increasingly constrained by forces beyond his control. The throne he occupied was powerful, but not absolute, and as tensions across the Atlantic intensified, the delicate balance between royal authority and ministerial power would face its most severe test. By the early 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies had entered dangerous territory. What had once been a distant imperial partnership was now strained by suspicion, resentment, and miscalculation. At the center of it all stood George III, a monarch determined to preserve imperial authority, yet increasingly portrayed across the Atlantic as a tyrant. The roots of the crisis lay not in sudden cruelty, but in the aftermath of victory. The 7 Years' War had transformed Britain into the dominant global power. France had been humbled. Vast territories in North America had come under British control. Yet triumph came at enormous financial cost. The national debt had nearly doubled. Maintaining troops along the American frontier to defend against potential uprisings and foreign threats required continued funding. British ministers believed it was reasonable, indeed necessary, for the colonies to contribute. From London's perspective, Parliament possessed unquestioned sovereignty over the empire. This principle had guided British governance for generations. But in America, a different interpretation had taken root. Colonists insisted that while they owed loyalty to the crown, only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. The slogan that emerged, "No taxation without representation," captured a growing constitutional divide. When Parliament introduced revenue measures such as the Townshend duties, colonial resistance hardened. Boycotts of British goods spread. Political clubs formed. Newspapers published fiery editorials condemning imperial overreach. Protests sometimes escalated into violence. British officials stationed in the colonies found themselves caught between enforcing the law and avoiding provocation. Tensions reached a boiling point in Boston. The city had become a center of resistance, its harbor a symbol of colonial defiance. In March 1770, British troops fired on a hostile crowd in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though only 5 colonists were killed, the event reverberated throughout the colonies. Patriot leaders used it as powerful propaganda, depicting British soldiers as instruments of oppression. In London, the king and his ministers saw matters differently. They viewed resistance not as a noble defense of liberty, but as dangerous insubordination. If Parliament retreated under pressure, what precedent would that set? Would Ireland demand similar concessions? Would other colonies challenge imperial authority? To yield, many believed, was to invite fragmentation. For a brief moment, tensions eased when most of the Townshend duties were repealed. Yet the underlying dispute remained unresolved. Parliament insisted on its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases. American leaders insisted on self-governance in matters of taxation. The constitutional gap widened. The crisis reignited dramatically in 1773 with the passage of the Tea Act. Designed to rescue the financially troubled East India Company, the act allowed it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. Ironically, the measure made tea cheaper for Americans. But colonial merchants saw it as a ploy to undercut them and reinforce Parliament's authority to tax. In December 1773, protesters in Boston boarded British ships and dumped chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not merely an act of vandalism, it was a deliberate challenge to imperial power. The response from Britain was swift and uncompromising. Parliament passed what became known in America as the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and altering the Massachusetts Charter to strengthen royal control. To British officials, these measures were necessary discipline. To many colonists, they confirmed fears of tyranny. As colonial assemblies convened in protest, a Continental Congress formed to coordinate resistance. The language of rights and liberty grew sharper. Pamphlets circulated arguing that the colonies were not subordinate provinces, but political communities with inherent sovereignty. Among the voices gaining prominence were men like George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the earlier war, and Thomas Jefferson, whose pen would soon shape revolutionary ideology. In April 1775, violence erupted at Lexington and Concord. British troops marching to seize colonial military supplies encountered armed resistance. Shots were fired. The war had begun. What had started as a constitutional dispute was now an armed rebellion. George III viewed the uprising as open revolt. In August 1775, he declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. To him, the issue was no longer about taxation or policy nuance, it was about authority and order. No empire could survive if provincial assemblies could defy the sovereign legislature at will. His critics would later argue that he underestimated colonial resolve. Supporters insisted he had little choice. The conflict quickly escalated beyond a localized rebellion. Washington took command of the Continental Army. Though poorly supplied and inexperienced compared to British forces, the Americans proved resilient. Britain possessed the world's most powerful navy and a professional army, yet fighting across vast distances posed logistical challenges. Supplying troops across the Atlantic required months of planning. Communications were slow. Decisions made in London often arrived too late to influence events effectively. In 1776, the conflict reached a decisive ideological turning point. The Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Drafted primarily by Jefferson, the document laid blame directly at the feet of the king. It listed grievances accusing him of dissolving legislatures, obstructing justice, maintaining standing armies without consent, and waging war against his own subjects. Whether or not each charge reflected the precise constitutional reality, the symbolism was unmistakable. George III had become the embodiment of oppression in the American imagination. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. British forces captured New York and later Philadelphia. Yet American resistance persisted. The turning point came in 1777 at Saratoga, where a British army surrendered, convincing France to enter the war on the American side. What had begun as a colonial rebellion transformed into a global conflict. Spain and the Dutch Republic would later join against Britain. The empire found itself fighting on multiple fronts. For the king, the war was a test of endurance and principle. He supported Lord North's government throughout the conflict, resisting calls from some political factions to negotiate prematurely. In private correspondence, he expressed determination to see the rebellion crushed. Yet as years passed and casualties mounted, public opinion in Britain grew weary. The financial burden increased. The promise of quick victory faded. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown after being trapped by American and French forces. Though fighting continued briefly, the strategic situation was clear. Britain could not subdue the colonies without enormous additional cost. Lord North's government collapsed in 1782, negotiations began. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the independence of the United States. Britain retained Canada and other territories, but the 13 colonies were lost. For the first time in modern history, a European power had relinquished a substantial portion of its empire to a successful rebellion. The loss was a profound blow. Across Europe, rivals watched closely. Was Britain weakened beyond repair? Had the young king's determination cost the empire its most valuable possessions? Opinions diverged sharply. Some blamed ministerial mismanagement. Others blamed parliamentary rigidity. In America, George III remained etched in memory as the monarch who had tried to crush liberty. Yet history would reveal a more complicated picture. Britain did not collapse after losing America. In fact, it would go on to expand its empire elsewhere, particularly in India and the Pacific. The defeat forced political reassessment, financial reform, and strategic adaptation. For George III personally, the loss was sobering but not fatal to his authority. Unlike Francis Louis XVI, he did not face revolution at home. Britain's constitutional framework proved resilient. The king continued to reign, his role evolving within the system rather than being destroyed by it. Still, the American Revolution marked a defining chapter of his life. It reshaped the Atlantic world and permanently altered the relationship between monarchy and liberty. What had begun as a dispute over taxation ended with the birth of a new republic. And in that transformation, George III became one of the central figures, viewed by some as obstinate and misguided, by others as a sovereign defending parliamentary sovereignty. America had slipped away. But the story of his reign was far from over. By the late 1780s, the American War was over, the empire had endured its most humiliating defeat, and Britain was cautiously rebuilding its confidence. Politically, the kingdom had stabilized under the leadership of William Pitt the Younger. Economically, reforms were beginning to reduce debt and restore fiscal order. It appeared that George III had survived the greatest crisis of his reign. But a far more personal and devastating challenge was about to emerge, one that would reshape both his life and the monarchy itself. In the autumn of 1788, alarming reports began to circulate from Windsor. The king, normally disciplined and methodical, was behaving erratically. He spoke for hours without pause. His thoughts raced from topic to topic without coherence. He suffered from insomnia, agitation, and bursts of manic energy. At times he appeared confused, at others, wildly animated. Courtiers were stunned. Ministers grew anxious. Rumors spread rapidly through London. This was not entirely unprecedented. There had been earlier episodes, brief periods in which the king seemed overwhelmed or disoriented. But never before had the symptoms been so severe or so prolonged. Now, at age 50, George III appeared to be losing control of his own mind. Physicians were summoned. Among them was Dr. Francis Willis, a clergyman physician known for treating mental disorders through strict routines and moral discipline. 18th-century medicine possessed little understanding of psychiatric illness. The prevailing belief held that madness resulted from imbalances in the body or disruptions in moral character. Treatments were often harsh. Patients were restrained. Isolation was common. The king's condition deteriorated rapidly. Accounts describe him speaking endlessly, sometimes incoherently, as attendants struggled to keep pace. His physical health also declined. He experienced feverish episodes and severe abdominal pain. For weeks, Britain existed in a state of suspended anxiety. If the king were permanently incapacitated, who would govern? The constitutional dilemma was immediate and profound. Britain had no clear precedent for a reigning monarch who was alive but incapable. The heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was eager to assume authority. But he was politically aligned with opposition figures who distrusted Pitt's government. The prospect of a regency threatened to destabilize the fragile political balance. In Parliament, fierce debates erupted. Could the Prince of Wales claim regency as an automatic right? Or did Parliament possess the authority to define and limit the powers of a regent? Pitt argued for parliamentary control, proposing restrictions on the prince's authority should he assume power. The crisis was no longer purely medical, it had become constitutional. Meanwhile, public reaction was intense. Newspapers published daily updates, some accurate, many exaggerated. Satirists and caricaturists seized the moment. Whispers of the mad king began to circulate. Though the phrase would gain greater popularity in later generations, the seeds of the image were planted here. To critics of monarchy, the episode exposed the fragility of hereditary rule. If the stability of the nation depended on the mental health of one man, how secure was the system? Yet in early 1789, an unexpected recovery occurred. Gradually, the king's speech slowed. His coherence returned. Physical symptoms subsided. By spring, he was declared fit to resume his duties. The Regency Bill, which had been advancing through Parliament, was abandoned. George III returned to public life, greeted by genuine relief and celebration. For many Britons, the recovery felt almost providential. Church services gave thanks. Crowds cheered the king's reappearance. Sympathy replaced ridicule. The episode strengthened his image as a suffering but devoted monarch, one who endured personal trial in service to his country. But the illness did not disappear entirely. In the years that followed, there were periodic relapses, less severe at first, but troubling nonetheless. Each episode revived fears of instability. Each recovery brought temporary reassurance. Over time, the pattern created uncertainty at the heart of the monarchy. Historians and medical scholars have long debated the cause of his condition. For much of the 20th century, a popular theory suggested that George III suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can produce neurological symptoms. This hypothesis gained traction in part because it offered a physiological explanation consistent with some recorded symptoms, including abdominal pain and discolored urine. More recent scholarship, however, has questioned the porphyria diagnosis. Modern analyses of surviving medical notes suggest that his symptoms align more closely with bipolar disorder or another form of mental illness characterized by manic episodes. The truth remains uncertain. 18th-century medical records are incomplete and filtered through contemporary misunderstanding. What is clear is that the king endured genuine and profound suffering. The human dimension of the crisis is often overshadowed by political drama. George III was not merely a monarch facing constitutional challenge, he was a man confronting the terrifying erosion of his own mind. Letters from those close to him describe moments of clarity interrupted by overwhelming confusion. He oscillated between lucidity and agitation. For a ruler who prided himself on discipline and self-control, the experience must have been deeply humiliating. His family, too, bore the strain. Queen Charlotte remained steadfastly loyal, overseeing his care and shielding him from public spectacle. Their marriage, unusually stable by royal standards, became a source of strength during these years. Yet the burden of uncertainty weighed heavily. Each relapse threatened to reopen political conflict. The crisis of 1788–89 left lasting marks on British constitutional development. It clarified Parliament's authority in matters of regency and reinforced the principle that sovereignty ultimately rested not solely in the person of the monarch, but within a broader constitutional framework. The monarchy survived, but in a subtly altered form. For George III, the illness introduced a shadow that would lengthen over time. Though he continued to reign actively for 2 more decades, the fear of relapse never vanished. His authority, once grounded in personal diligence and moral certainty, now seemed vulnerable to forces beyond his control. The label of "Mad King" would echo through history, often unfairly simplifying a complex reality. He was not perpetually insane, nor was he uniquely unstable among rulers of his era. What distinguished his case was the timing. His illness unfolded in a period of expanding public discourse, growing press freedom, and intense political rivalry. His suffering became public spectacle, yet despite these trials, the monarchy endured. Britain did not descend into revolution as France soon would. Institutions held. Government functioned. The king returned, again and again, to his duties. Still, the episode revealed a fragile truth. Beneath the ceremony, beneath the imperial power, beneath the image of unshakable authority, the stability of a kingdom rested on the health of a single human mind. And that mind had proven painfully vulnerable. In 1789, as George III was regaining stability after his first major bout of illness, an event unfolded across the English Channel that would shake every throne in Europe. The French Revolution began not as a war against Britain, but as a political upheaval within France itself. Yet its consequences would soon engulf the continent and draw Britain into one of the longest and most transformative conflicts of the age. At first, many in Britain viewed the early stages of the revolution with cautious optimism. France had long been Britain's rival, but the overthrow of royal absolutism did not initially appear to threaten British stability. Some politicians even interpreted the fall of the Bastille as a sign that France might evolve toward a constitutional system similar to Britain's own. George III, however, was no radical reformer. Though he ruled within constitutional limits, he believed deeply in monarchy as an institution of order and continuity. The spectacle of a king's authority being dismantled by popular uprising stirred unease. Still, Britain did not immediately intervene. The government of William Pitt the Younger focused on domestic recovery and financial reform, wary of costly foreign entanglements. The revolution soon took a darker turn. Political factions within France clashed violently. Radical leaders gained dominance. In 1793, King Louis XVI was tried and executed. The execution of a fellow monarch sent shockwaves through Europe. It was not merely the fall of a king, it was the public rejection of monarchy itself. For rulers across the continent, including George III, this was more than a French tragedy, it was an existential warning. France declared war on Britain in February 1793. The ideological struggle became military reality. Britain now faced a revolutionary government that claimed to represent universal liberty and challenged traditional dynastic order. The conflict would stretch across oceans and decades. At sea, Britain's strength was formidable. The Royal Navy was the backbone of its defense and empire. Early naval engagements demonstrated British superiority, ensuring that French ambitions to invade the British Isles would remain largely theoretical. Yet on land, the picture was more complicated. Revolutionary France mobilized massive citizen armies, infused with fervor and nationalism. Traditional European coalitions struggled to contain this new force. Within Britain, the war stirred both patriotism and anxiety. Revolutionary ideas crossed the Channel along with news of events. Radical societies formed, advocating parliamentary reform and expanded suffrage. The government responded with caution and repression, passing laws to curb sedition and restrict public gatherings. George III supported these measures, viewing them as necessary to prevent revolutionary contagion. As the war intensified, a young Corsican artillery officer began to rise through the ranks of the French army. His name would soon become synonymous with ambition and conquest: Napoleon Bonaparte. By the late 1790s, Napoleon had demonstrated extraordinary military talent in Italy and Egypt. In 1799, he seized power in France through a coup, establishing himself as first consul. For Britain, Napoleon's ascent signaled both danger and opportunity. On one hand, his leadership stabilized France and revitalized its military effectiveness. On the other, his consolidation of power replaced revolutionary chaos with a single, identifiable adversary. The war shifted from ideological upheaval to strategic rivalry. The conflict evolved into a global contest. In the Caribbean, India, and the Mediterranean, British and French forces clashed for control of trade routes and colonies. The seas became arenas of decisive confrontation. In 1798, British Admiral Horatio Nelson achieved a dramatic victory at the Battle of the Nile, crippling French naval ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean. Though land campaigns continued across Europe, Britain's naval dominance remained its greatest asset. Domestically, the strain of war weighed heavily. Taxes increased. Trade disruptions affected merchants and laborers alike. Yet Britain's financial system proved resilient. The Bank of England and Pitt's fiscal policies helped sustain the war effort. Unlike France, Britain did not rely on mass conscription. Instead, it leveraged naval power and financial subsidies to support continental allies. George III's role during these years was steady rather than flamboyant. He was no battlefield commander, nor did he craft tactical strategies. His influence lay in continuity. He supported the government's determination to resist French expansion. He embodied stability at a time when monarchy elsewhere seemed fragile. While Louis XVI had lost his head to revolution, George III remained on his throne, a symbol that constitutional monarchy could survive modern turbulence. In 1802, a temporary respite arrived with the Treaty of Amiens. For a brief moment, peace returned. British travelers crossed to France. Trade resumed cautiously. Yet the truce was uneasy and short-lived. Mutual suspicion lingered. Napoleon's ambitions in Europe clashed with Britain's commitment to balance of power. By 1803, war had resumed. This renewed conflict would become even more expansive. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, transforming revolutionary France into an imperial force. His armies dominated much of continental Europe. Austria, Prussia, and Russia faced repeated defeats. Britain stood largely alone, protected by the Channel and its navy. The threat of invasion loomed. Napoleon assembled forces along the French coast, preparing what seemed a serious attempt to cross into England. The tension reached its climax in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. There, Admiral Nelson delivered a decisive victory, destroying much of the combined French and Spanish fleet. Though Nelson himself was killed in the battle, Britain's naval supremacy was secured for generations. The war with revolutionary, and later Napoleonic, France was not a single campaign, but a prolonged era of conflict. For George III, it spanned much of his later reign. He witnessed the transformation of Europe's political map. He saw monarchy challenged, destroyed, and reconfigured. Through it all, Britain remained defiant. Yet the cost was immense. Financial strain deepened. Social unrest simmered among industrial workers and rural poor. The king's own health grew increasingly fragile. The mental resilience that had allowed him to recover in 1789 would be tested again. The war against revolutionary France was more than a military contest. It was a struggle over the future shape of Europe, over monarchy, sovereignty, and the rights of nations. For George III, it represented both vindication and vulnerability. He had lost America, but he had not lost his throne. He now faced an adversary who sought to reorder the continent itself. In resisting revolutionary France and later Napoleon's empire, Britain preserved its independence and expanded its influence overseas. Yet the shadow of war lengthened across the king's final decades. The storm that began in Paris would not fully subside until long after his mind had retreated from public life. By the early 19th century, the struggle with France had evolved beyond revolution. It had become a duel between empires: Britain, sustained by sea power and finance, and a France transformed into a continental juggernaut under Napoleon Bonaparte. What began as ideological confrontation was now a battle for global supremacy. Napoleon's victories on land were astonishing. Austria fell at Austerlitz in 1805. Prussia was crushed at Jena in 1806. One by one, European powers bowed to French dominance. Only Britain remained consistently defiant. Protected by the Channel and commanded by the Royal Navy, it stood outside Napoleon's continental system. But isolation did not mean safety. In 1806, Napoleon launched the Continental System, an economic blockade designed to cripple Britain by denying it access to European markets. Ports under French control were closed to British goods. Neutral ships were pressured to comply. The goal was simple: starve Britain economically and force surrender without invasion. The British response was equally strategic. Through naval supremacy, Britain enforced its own blockades, intercepting trade and undermining French commerce. The seas became arteries of economic warfare. British merchants adapted quickly, expanding trade routes beyond Europe, to India, the Caribbean, South America, and beyond. Ironically, the attempt to isolate Britain accelerated its global commercial reach. Naval power was the cornerstone of British resilience. The decisive moment had come at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Admiral Horatio Nelson secured dominance that would last for a century. Though Nelson fell in battle, his victory ensured that Napoleon would never command the seas. Without naval control, any invasion of Britain remained impractical. Yet the war was not confined to ships and blockades. On land, Britain sought opportunities to weaken French influence indirectly. One such arena was the Iberian Peninsula. In 1808, Napoleon's attempt to control Spain ignited widespread resistance. Britain intervened, supporting Portuguese and Spanish forces. The Peninsular War became a grinding conflict that drained French resources and morale. It was here that a British commander, Arthur Wellesley, later known as Duke of Wellington, emerged as a formidable leader. Through careful strategy and relentless campaigning, Wellington's forces pushed back against French armies. The Iberian struggle proved that Napoleon's dominance was not invincible. Meanwhile, beyond Europe, Britain expanded its imperial footprint. In India, British influence deepened through the East India Company. In the Mediterranean, strategic islands were secured. Across the Atlantic, colonial holdings were strengthened. Though America had been lost decades earlier, Britain's global reach was wider than ever. For George III, these years were marked by paradox. While Britain achieved military and naval successes, his personal world narrowed. Episodes of mental illness returned with increasing severity after 1801. Though he experienced periods of clarity, his capacity to govern weakened gradually. The burden of leadership shifted more heavily to ministers and, eventually, to his son. In 1810, the king suffered a final and irreversible breakdown. Blindness followed. His speech grew incoherent. The once meticulous ruler who had read dispatches line by line could no longer follow the affairs of state. In 1811, the Prince of Wales was formally appointed as Prince Regent, assuming royal authority. The Regency era had begun. Even as George III receded into isolation, the war continued to shape Europe's destiny. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of his downfall. The catastrophic retreat from Moscow shattered the myth of his invincibility. A new coalition of European powers formed, determined to end French dominance once and for all. In 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. But in 1815, he returned in a dramatic bid to reclaim power, the 100 Days. The final confrontation came at Waterloo, where Wellington and Prussian forces delivered the decisive defeat. Napoleon was exiled permanently to St. Helena. By the time of Waterloo, George III was no longer aware of the triumph. Isolated in Windsor Castle, blind and mentally incapacitated, he lived in a world detached from the empire he had once guided. The war that had consumed Europe for over 2 decades ended without his active participation in its final chapter. The Napoleonic Wars reshaped the global order. Britain emerged not only victorious but dominant. Its navy ruled the seas. Its trade network spanned continents. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 established a balance of power that would prevent major continental war for decades. Britain stood at the center of this new order. Yet the triumph was bittersweet. The king who had presided over this era of conflict and endurance would never fully comprehend its conclusion. His reign had spanned the loss of America, the rise and fall of Napoleon, and the transformation of Britain into the world's leading imperial power. He had endured political storms, public ridicule, and personal suffering. The long shadow of Napoleon defined the final active decades of his reign. It tested Britain's institutions and proved their resilience. It demonstrated that constitutional monarchy, supported by parliamentary government and naval strength, could withstand revolutionary upheaval. When historians look back on this period, they see a nation forged in war and refined by adversity. And at its center, visible at times, obscured at others, stood George III, a monarch whose life bridged eras of revolution, empire, and transformation. The wars had ended. Britain had prevailed. But the king who had once declared himself proud to be a Briton now existed in silence, unaware that the world he helped shape had entered a new age. By the second decade of the 19th century, George III's reign had entered its final, most tragic chapter. The monarch who had once taken pride in reading every dispatch, annotating every report, and actively shaping British policy was now consumed by illness. His mind, already strained by decades of political turmoil and personal pressures, gave way to the relentless progression of mental disorder. By 1810, George III was formally deemed incapable of ruling, and the Prince of Wales acted as regent, a shift that would last for the remainder of the king's life. The king's condition was marked by profound physical and mental deterioration. Blindness, a cruel companion to his previous episodes of mania and depression, forced him into near-total isolation. Communication became fragmented, he could no longer participate meaningfully in governance, and even the simplest decisions required mediation by attendants and ministers. Once the embodiment of diligence and discipline, George III had become a symbol of vulnerability. Yet despite his incapacitation, George III's presence remained significant. His illness highlighted the resilience of British institutions. The Regency Act of 1811 provided a constitutional framework for the transfer of royal authority, ensuring continuity of governance. Ministers continued to administer the empire, guiding Britain through post-Napoleonic reconstruction, financial stabilization, and international diplomacy. Parliament, the cabinet, and the monarchy together sustained the state, proving that the crown's power was no longer dependent solely on the health or capability of the sovereign. The years of isolation took a profound toll on the king's family life. Queen Charlotte remained steadfast, visiting him regularly and overseeing his care. Their children, especially the future George IV, navigated the tension between filial duty and political necessity. The royal household became both a sanctuary and a containment, shielding the king from public view while maintaining the ceremonial dignity of monarchy. Public perception of George III was complex. For some, he was a figure of sympathy, a once great monarch brought low by the fragility of human health. For others, his mental decline reinforced critiques of hereditary rule and the vulnerability of absolute authority. Nevertheless, the British people largely retained respect for the king's earlier devotion, moral rectitude, and steadfast commitment to national service. His image became one of tragic dignity rather than scandal or ridicule. Though he no longer ruled actively, George III continued to live within the walls of Windsor Castle, attended by physicians, servants, and family. His condition remained stable but fragile. Periods of lucidity were rare, punctuated by long stretches of confusion or disorientation. Letters and accounts from attendants depict a man acutely aware at times of his dependence, and at other moments, lost entirely to the private torment of illness. The final years of George III's life coincided with a Britain transformed. The empire had survived revolutionary upheavals, lost the American colonies, defeated Napoleon, and emerged as the preeminent naval and commercial power. Industrialization was beginning to reshape society. Yet the king who had overseen these transformations did so from the shadows, removed from public engagement. His personal decline stood in stark contrast to the nation's growing confidence. On January 29, 1820, George III passed away at Windsor Castle at the age of 81. His death marked the end of a reign spanning over 60 years, the longest in British history at that time. The nation mourned, reflecting both on his personal hardships and the extraordinary historical events he had witnessed: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the emergence of Britain as a global power. Historically, George III occupies a complex place. He has been remembered as a dedicated and conscientious monarch, whose personal virtues often contrasted with the political crises surrounding him. At the same time, his insistence on exercising influence in government, his handling of colonial rebellion, and the episodes of mental illness created controversy that colored his reputation. He was a man of his age, navigating a monarchy under strain, a country facing unprecedented challenges, and an empire stretching across continents. Ultimately, George III's life story is one of endurance, through triumph, disaster, illness, and isolation. His reign demonstrated both the power and limitations of monarchy in a changing world. Though blind and incapacitated in his later years, the institutions he had shaped, defended, and trusted continued to function, carrying Britain forward into the 19th century. The Mad King of later legend was, in reality, a sovereign whose personal trials illuminated the resilience of the crown and the evolving nature of constitutional authority. His legacy endures not only in the victories and losses of his era but in the complex human story of a king who sought to reconcile duty, principle, and personal limitation in the service of his nation. Ultimately, George III's legacy defies simple categorization. He was neither a perfect sovereign nor an unmitigated tyrant. He was a monarch caught between eras, facing unprecedented historical pressures while bound by personal conviction and constitutional duty. His life encompassed triumph and failure, vigor and illness, authority and vulnerability, that he remains a figure of fascination precisely because of this complexity, a king who was at once human and symbol, who struggled with personal and political challenges in equal measure. In the final assessment, George III may be best remembered not as a tyrant or as a flawless ruler, but as a tragic monarch, a sovereign whose strengths and weaknesses alike shaped the destiny of Britain and left an indelible mark on the course of history. His reign closed the chapter on an age of colonial expansion, global war, and political transformation. Yet the story of George III endures, a testament to the human dimensions of power, the challenges of leadership, and the thin line between authority and vulnerability that defines every age of monarchy.